I just want to do some introductions to ground us, but they'll be short because we don't have a lot of time. So my name is Shereen Marisol Meraji. I'm a longtime journalist, and I run the audio journalism program at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. You might know me because I helped create NPR's Code Switch podcast, where we discuss race and identity, and I was a producer and co-host for many years. And joining me on stage are two phenomenal journalists and authors. Ari Berman is the national voting rights correspondent for Mother Jones and author of the new book, Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. Minority Rule exposes the long history of the conflict between white supremacy and multiracial democracy. Ari explains in the book how reactionary white conservatives have entrenched power through voter suppression, gerrymandering, the takeover of the courts, and the whitewashing of history, and that's the short list. And Zack Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad. His most recent book is called The Reactionary Spirit: How America's Most Insidious Political Tradition Swept the World. In it, Zack traces how a reactionary, anti-democratic ethos born and bred right here in the United States is infecting democracies around the world. And the book takes us beyond the United States to Hungary, Israel, and India. Thank you both for being here. I loved your books. Essential reading for these times. They didn't pay me to say that. All right, we set the table. Let's begin at the beginning. In both of your introductions, we meet men who take great pride in their connections to the Confederacy. Ari, you begin your book talking about Pat Buchanan. Who remembers Pat Buchanan? He's still alive, in his late 80s, awesome. For those of you who don't, he's a conservative strategist, two-time Republican presidential candidate who has on many occasions celebrated his slave-holding Confederate ancestors. Ari, why is it important that we remember Pat Buchanan?
Sure, he's very popular in Berkeley right now. I wanted to start with Buchanan because it really illustrated one of the larger themes of my book, which is that the crisis of American democracy is bigger and deeper than just Donald Trump. That Donald Trump is certainly an accelerant to the democratic crisis we face, but he's also a product of a broken political system, and he's also a product of broader ideological trends. And so the reason why I started with Buchanan was because Buchanan was really the first major figure in the Republican Party who made opposition to demographic change the central organizing principle of his presidential runs in 1992 and 1996. And he warned that the country's white majority was becoming what he called an emerging white minority, that the Republican Party had to do everything it could, whether it was on immigration or voting rights or cultural issues, to stop that from happening. And I basically argue that even though that didn't succeed at the time, it laid the groundwork for Trump, and that it was part of this very long fight throughout American history, which is, should America embrace multiracial democracy, or should it embrace white supremacy? And unfortunately, in American history, we have done both. There has been times when America has turned its back on a multiracial democracy, and there has been times when America has embraced multiracial democracy. And I think that is the same fight that we're currently going through right now in terms of how democratic should we be, and who should be part of American democracy, and who will be excluded from American democracy. And that is a 230-year story that I think is very much ongoing today.
And Zack, in your introduction, you introduced us to Scott Terry, who you met while reporting at CPAC, which is the Conservative Political Action Conference. This is back in 2013. And Scott Terry was a conference attendee. He's young, he was from North Carolina. And when you spoke to Scott, he told you that he believed that white people should control the political system in the United States, saying that if black people didn't like it, they could, quote, be allowed to vote in Africa. But what struck you more forcefully than that about Scott Terry was his claim that he was a descendant of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Why was it so significant, that meeting with Scott Terry and his relationship with Jefferson Davis, that you decided that's how you wanted to open your book?
Well, the Jefferson Davis thing is a bit of a plot twist, because were it true, it would mean that Scott Terry and I were cousins. On my dad's side, our family goes all the way back to, the founding families of Texas. We have like a lot of Southern families, family historians. That's just sort of a tradition thing. And they found out at one point that our great uncle was the Confederate president, the one and only. The Jefferson Davis Library, I contacted them at Rice University. They did not know about this, so we scored some points for history, I guess, in doing so. But the reason I did that was not just to be like, oh, isn't that weird? But because it made me think about a sort of, borrowing a concept from Naomi Klein, a doppelganger history of myself, right? Like, what is it about his upbringing that was so different from mine? What was he exposed to? What elements of American political culture did Scott imbibe that led him to become essentially the alt-right before the alt-right existed, in a fundamental sense, right? He was the forerunner of what we see now among the youth cadre of the conservative movement as really the dominant voice, right? And had come to define in the Trump era young Republican politics. Now, for me, the explanation is somewhat obvious. It's my mom's side of the family. A big part of the book is about tracing these two conflicting family histories. My mom's side of the family were refugees from the Holocaust, which profoundly shaped my appreciation for the United States and gave, as a country that took us in, but in a very particular sense, right? For Scott, the United States was a country that was defined by its ethnic majority, by democracy, as Ari said, not being multiracial but monoracial, a democracy for one kind of people. But for me, what's beautiful about the American democratic tradition is that it's not democracy for one people. It's that it could take people in, penniless victims of genocide, right? Bring them into the country, integrate them into our society, and give my family a home, and create such an open society that the really political royalty on my dad's side from the South could end up marrying a Jewish refugee and converting to Judaism. And those gave me insight not just into sort of the nature of the two visions or different approaches to American politics and the sort of personal and sociological factors that shape the way that people see things, but also, I think, a deep tension at the heart of the democratic project itself, right? A question that every democracy has to ask, which is, who is this for? And the who is this for question, I think this is not just an American problem, it's a global problem, right? In the democratic era, is not just in the US, as Ari, I think, articulated very well, but also in these other countries that I examine in my book. Who is this for? Is the question that has set off anti-democratic backsliding, and is really the defining motivation of anti-democratic movements in democracies around the world.
Both of you spend a lot of time writing about the South in your books, more specifically how reactionary conservatives in the South have long been fighting against multiracial democracy and fighting for the maintenance of a racial hierarchy in politics, where white men are on top and they're going to be on top forever. What scares you most about the tactics that right-wing conservatives have employed in the southern states? Ari, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that scares me the most is that America had multiracial democracy after the Civil War. It was written into the Constitution very explicitly in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which for the first time, equality, the whole idea of equality was written into the Constitution, and it was violently overthrown. So it shows that rights can be extended, but then taken away. Barack Obama liked to quote Martin Luther King on the campaign trail, that famous quote, "The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." But the truth is that often when it's bending towards justice, it furiously snaps back. And so the fact that we had multiracial democracy in the South for this brief period of time in the 1860s and 1870s, we had things like black governors and senators from places like Mississippi and Louisiana, something that's never happened since, and it was violently overthrown. And the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments basically became dead letters. And we had white supremacy become a fact of life and Jim Crow become a fact of life for nearly 100 years. That to me is extremely alarming. And the fact that those tactics are still being employed today. You look at, for example, this year, is the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act is a fascinating piece of legislation because it was basically written to enforce the 15th Amendment of 1870, which had been ignored for nearly 100 years. That was the whole reason we had to pass the Voting Rights Act in the first place, because the 15th Amendment wasn't being enforced. Well, we now have a Justice Department under Trump that is systematically rolling back the Voting Rights Act, that has basically purged all the lawyers from the voting section, all the lawyers from the Civil Rights Division, and that's just one example of the kind of anti-democratic thing we're seeing. But I think basically they've gone back and they've looked at the overthrow of Reconstruction as a blueprint for how white supremacy can be enforced, how white supremacy can become a fact of law, even when multiracial democracy should be the law of the land.
Zach, before you go on, can you also weave in your definition of the reactionary spirit into your answer?
Yes, I will, because I want to talk about the ideological complement to Ari's policy discussion, right, which is that the South, as I see it, it's not just a sort of testing ground or a place where different policy ideas came from. It's the natural home of an ideological tradition that is every bit as American as the one that we learned in schools, but one that is fundamentally opposed to the vision of the country that most of us are taught. Right, I trace this back to the 17th century, right, well before the founding of the United States, that in order to justify the creation of chattel slavery, the Southern intellectuals and political leadership, starting with the Stuart Kings in England, right, imported feudal visions and ideas of a hierarchical society into the United States. Right, this was an intentional project by the British government, which was attempting to outcompete the Dutch in terms of the global slave trade at that point in time. Right, so they wanted to make slavery coterminous with the idea of British rule, and they wanted to give it the imprint of the monarchy, which had recently been restored after the English Revolution. So what happened, what the Spirit has, sort of these material and political factors, created a distinct ideology that is essentially an American version of feudalism, right, that's centered on race. And it was born out of a need to make slavery seem like an essential part of American society. And this vision is very much not what you see in the founding documents. And the founders were aware of this, right, and they grappled with it very much. But it became an unbearable tension, right, in the run-up to the Civil War. There was, I think there's a fascinating book by Kedrick Roy, who's a political theorist at Harvard, and Kedrick's argument in his book, and one that I echoed and did, frankly, much worse, go read Kedrick's book too, is that the feudal tradition in the South was embraced explicitly by figures like John C. Calhoun and George Fitzhugh. And then it was opposed and understood to be feudal, not just by, mainstream political leaders like Abraham Lincoln, but black intellectuals at the time. So Frederick Douglass and what he terms the black liberal tradition at that point, right, one that was focused on individual rights. And it was the clash between these two traditions, between these two visions of what America was for, a country as an idea centered on equality and taking human equality seriously, versus a vision of the United States as a country that stood and was defined by a kind of feudal hierarchy along color lines that has been the essential conflict in American politics. I think it's really the sort of foundational shaping conflict in a way that nothing else is in the United States. Now, to your question, right, is like, how does this fit into a broader, sort of more theoretical concept of the reactionary spirit? So, as I define that in the book, the reactionary spirit is it's a perennial tradition in democratic societies, right? It comes up all the time, where when there is an attempt to change a society, to make it more egalitarian, to bring it more in line with that first American tradition I was talking about, that it provokes an anti-democratic backlash, a group of people who are so committed to existing social hierarchies that they choose to prioritize the maintenance of hierarchy over democracy itself. That is to say, anti-democratic politics is a byproduct of a commitment to social inequality, right? So not they hate democracy and therefore they're just sort of acting out of pure animus. It's because they believe deeply, for whatever reason, that the existing distribution of power and resources is just. And therefore, if democracy is getting in the way of maintaining that hierarchy, democracy has to go. And the reason I came to this after that long discursus on two American traditions is that it is this Southern political tradition, which has been exported and is now a much more widely held American view, Southern-born, English-born tradition that really defines the American reactionary spirit, that is its central ideological component. And there are different versions of this for each country, but that's ours.
For those of us in this room who are obsessed with national politics, why should we be paying more attention to state and local politics, Ari?
That's a great question. Because I argue basically that the states have been the incubators of so much of the anti-democratic things that Trump is doing right now. And that the radicalization against democracy within the Republican Party started at the state level and came to Washington rather than the other way around. I started covering the issue of voting rights after the 2010 election, when so many states flipped from blue to red. Places like Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Ohio. And we began to see the first new restrictions on voting in the modern times. Things like rampant gerrymandering, right-wing judges being appointed who would have never served before. And that was really the catalyst for so much of what Trump wanted to do. Trump took his ideas from those places, but also it was the radicalization against democracy that made a Trump-like figure possible, and also made it so that you could rule without having popular support. And that's why my book is called Minority Rule, because it's this idea that someone could hold a majority of power without a majority of support. And to me, that's so antithetical to the founding ideas that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence, which is the idea that democracy is based on the consent of the governed. Then you look at, for example, places like Wisconsin, where they passed these incredibly gerrymandered maps after 2011, so that in the state legislature, Democrats got 54% of the vote statewide in 2018, but Republicans were able to get 64% of seats. I mean, that to me shows that you can get a minority of support, but you can have a huge, not just a majority of power, but a huge majority of power. And so I think that the states were so important in terms of laying the groundwork for Trump, but the states have also, even now, are so important as a resistance to Trump. Because I think the first tangible sites of resistance in this country will not be in Washington or at the federal level. They will be in the states. One of the reasons why Elon Musk said he is leaving Washington is because he lost the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. And I urge everyone to pay attention to this. Musk dropped $25 million onto that race. He tried to buy the race. It was the first example of a statewide election under Trump. And it was very clear that this was going to be a referendum on oligarchy, on whether or not what Trump could do in 2024 would just happen at the state level, and they could just go state by state and state. They could buy whatever court or whatever office they didn't like. But at the same time, if it failed, and it failed overwhelmingly, the candidate that Musk opposed won by 10 points, which is a landslide in a place like Wisconsin. And it sent a message, broadly speaking, that oligarchy could be defeated, that democracy still exists, at least at the state level. And it also sent a message to people like Musk, like, hey, maybe I should rethink what I'm doing in terms of spending, because it's not going to be so easy to take over these states like it was to take over Washington. So in general, I think something that Zack and I share is that state and local politics are dramatically undercovered. They have a huge overall significance. And when people think about what you can do in your own communities, and I know we're going to get to this later, it's so much easier to have an impact at the state level, to have an impact on a state legislative race, or even a state Supreme Court race, than it is to change who the president might be, or who your member of Congress might be, or something like that. So many fewer people vote in state politics, but it has such an outsized, in a country that gives so much power to the states have such an overwhelming role in terms of shaping our national politics in ways that many people don't realize.
I want to turn to journalism. I believe in self-reflection. Ari, what ways do you think journalists have maybe contributed to the conditions that have allowed authoritarian tendencies to take root here in the United States? You already sort of started talking about that.
Well, I think a lot of journalists have normalized a lot of the very extreme things that Trump has done, dating, I think, first back to 2016, when so many people, and I'm talking less about print journalism than broadcast journalism and some other things, basically viewed Trump as a good reality show and covered him as such and put him on over and over because that's what was good for ratings, and basically downplayed all the radical things Trump was doing because it was such a good story. And basically, they've admitted this. I mean, they've admitted, CBS and other people have basically said, yeah, it was shit for the country, but it was good for us. And so I think, they normalized Trump before, and I think, once again, I think there was a lot of normalization of him in 2024, where it was sort of like a clash between two personalities. First it was Biden and Trump, and then it was Harris and Trump. And I mean, whatever you thought about the two candidates, one was a dramatically bigger threat to the democratic process. And one tried to overturn the election and the other did not. And one of the things that was so striking to me about the 2024 campaign was the fact that Trump's effort to overturn the election was so far back in people's minds. And there was a lot of reason for that, and the chief people I blame were the Supreme Court for not allowing a trial on that issue. I think that is one of the main reasons why Trump won, because that trial did not happen, and it should have happened, and the insurrection was not at the top of people's minds. But I also blame the media for obsessing over things that, while they might have mattered, were not the biggest issue in the election. The biggest issue in the election was the fact that someone who tried to overthrow the 2020 election was able to get back into power. In other countries that Zack has studied and I've looked at, Trump wouldn't even have been able to run again, let alone be able to win and retake the very democratic process that he tried to overthrow.
Zack, do you want to?
I'm gonna defend our field a little bit, but not much, because as you can see at the end, this will be a little bit depressing. I don't think it's journalists' fault that we couldn't do that. Like, the reason why Donald Trump was not deemed unacceptable in 2024 was not because there wasn't unfavorable coverage of him in the mainstream press. It's because the Supreme Court said he could run. It's because the Supreme Court delayed all his trials. There were endless delaying efforts. The 14th Amendment effort to disqualify him was for a variety of reasons, actually some quite legally sound, unsuccessful. And so we end up in a situation where the legal architecture, so unlike these other countries like South Korea or Brazil, where they have arrested presidents who have committed anti-democratic offenses, actually quite normal. Prime Minister of Israel is literally on trial as he's presiding over a war. Not to say the Israeli political system is healthy in any meaningful sense, but that part of it is more healthy than the American one. We have a failure of a legal architecture, right, to enforce the way that our political system is supposed to work and what the rules are. And we have a failure of a social structure where everyone knew what Donald Trump did. The facts were readily available thanks to the media, and people didn't accept those facts, right? So why didn't they accept those facts? They didn't not because we didn't tell them, they did it because they didn't want to, right? And it's not that Fox News propagandized them into doing it. I think that it's the causation reversed. It's that Fox News exists because there's an audience that wants those things, right? There is deep, deep, deep social polarization in the United States that I think is a function of the sort of ideological cleavages and the social cleavages that we were talking about a second ago. There is a segment of the American population, I think Fox has contributed to its radicalization. I don't want to let them off the hook at all. There's pretty good political science evidence on this point. But Fox existed, and the reason it could succeed as a commercial enterprise is because these social cleavages existed, right? Ones that boxed people into partisan, racial, religious identities that made them fundamentally hostile to elements of the American project as it exists right now, right? If in a healthy society, Donald Trump would never have been able to win the Republican primary. That's when he would have been stopped, and it's where he should have been stopped. And he wasn't. Even though there were serious candidates opposing him, governors of large states, people who had long track records in public service, and they had no chance. They never had a chance. They never had a chance because the Republican Party is broken, because a majority of its voters are people who deeply, deeply, deeply object to the fundamental ideological structure of the United States right now. And that's not a problem that we in the press can solve by giving them new information or hectoring them. It's a fundamental problem for American society, and if I had an answer, I would tell you all it right now, and then I would go about trying to implement it and fundraise, right? But I don't. I have some marginal answers, but I think we need to be clear-eyed, at very least, about what the nature of the problem is.
Ari, you were critical of the coverage, especially the first go-round when Trump won, of the coverage that was coming out of Wisconsin You said that the media ran with the narrative that Hillary Clinton didn't visit Wisconsin and that is why she lost Wisconsin, rather than focusing on gerrymandering and all of the voter suppression efforts that were going on in Wisconsin. So that's an example that you gave where the press really fell down on the job.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we tend to overlook a lot of the structural issues that impact politics. And we tend to overstate personality when it comes to these races. And, I'm not going to defend the race that Hillary Clinton ran in Wisconsin. I think it was probably indefensible that she didn't visit the state. But listen, Kamala Harris visited Wisconsin a lot, and she lost it. But I think one of the things that was interesting to me was to go back and look at the impact. Wisconsin had a new voter ID law at the time, and it was implemented in a very haphazard way where a lot of people showed up and tried to get IDs and were not able to do so. And the University of Wisconsin went back and they did a study, and they found that a lot of people who didn't vote, a good percentage of people who didn't vote, cited that ID law as a reason why they didn't cast a ballot. And that disproportionately hurt voters of color, and it disproportionately hurt people that would have voted for Hillary Clinton. It wasn't the only reason why she lost the state, but it certainly contributed to it. And I think that kind of analysis is often overshadowed. Just to echo Zack's point, that the Supreme Court's role in the election was overshadowed by a lot of people. I mean, how many stories were written about the failings of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden's age? And those are legitimate topics to cover. Don't get me wrong. Biden's age was a real issue, and the Democratic Party does have structural problems. But again, we kind of just took it at face value that the Supreme Court said we're not going to have a trial over someone inciting an insurrection, trying to overthrow American democracy. It's just not going to happen, period. And the president's going to have king-like power. And we said, okay, well, the Supreme Court just said that, let's get on with the race. But that has shaped not just the fact that Trump won, but what he's done since he got back in power. Because I guarantee you, he took it as a green light, where he said, okay, if they're not going to get me on inciting the insurrection, I can do whatever the hell I want. And that's how he has acted from day one of the administration, like he can do whatever the hell he wants. And a lot of things have gotten blocked in court so far, but they've gotten blocked in lower courts. And they've gotten even blocked by Trump judges in lower courts, which Trump is not so happy about right now. But we all have to pause until the Supreme Court weighs in. And the Supreme Court is the biggest embodiment of minority rule in the country right now, because 5 of the 6 Republican justices were appointed by Republican presidents who initially lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. And then they have entrenched minority rule by doing things like not holding Trump accountable for the insurrection, blessing widespread gerrymandering, all of those things. And so I would like the media, I agree with Zack, if everyone read the New York Times, we would be fine as a country. That's not the problem for as bad as looking at the New York Times. The bigger thing is that we are undervaluing other actors in the political system, like the Supreme Court, and the outside impact that they're having on what happens in this country.
You've touched on this, but I'm gonna ask you this because I want you to give a more specific answer to the question. So I'm a journalism professor.
Sure.
Any advice for journalists who are covering politics ahead of the midterms? What important storylines never get enough attention that need to get attention?
That never get attention. That's interesting. The problem is there's like a deluge.
Yeah.
Right? It's like there's too many things to focus on. So to say, and frankly, a lot of it's getting attention in individual media accounts, right? There's often a demand side problem for us. So like one example I like to use is that there is a truly atrocious humanitarian situation going on in Sudan, probably the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, and you never hear about it. And it's not because journalists don't cover it, right? NBC just did a large, on-the-ground reporting project that came out, but raise your hands if you read it, right? Like I think almost none of you did. And I'm not blaming you personally. I mean that the articles that tend to catch on, right, are ones that play into the interests and the biases of the readers that exist right now. We can't manufacture interest in stories when people don't care about them. as much as we try. Sometimes it works, sometimes, on a very rare occasion, you can uncover a piece of information or talk about something that people aren't paying attention to, and that can go viral. But my God, it is hard. It really doesn't work 99.9% of the time. We just can't do that. Which is now a roundabout way of saying, what do I think people should be focusing on, right? And I think that there are like two really critical storylines, right? One is the way in which Trump's arbitrary exercise of power is affecting individual people's lives, right? This isn't just an abstract story about the system of government, right? Because Trump has, or did prior to a recent court ruling, untrammeled and likely illegal or dubiously legal power to change tariffs at his whim, millions of people are suffering economically, right? That is a concrete fact that is of huge political relevance, right? There are millions of people who are afraid about being arbitrarily detained by ICE, which is operating like a secret police force right now. That has real and specific and terrifying effects for individual people. So I think telling those stories, right, trying to say that this is not just an abstract question, though I think the abstract questions are really important, right? That's sort of the second half of what I'm saying. That matters. But the second point is that when we talk about democracy, we need to talk about it in these terms that really resonate with people. And I think a lot of that is to appeal to common and shared American values. I alluded to this earlier, but there's a story that we all learned in school, in grade school, about what the country is and what it stands for. And what is happening right now is antithetical to that story at a deep, fundamental, and extremely obvious way. Right? If you go down the list of, nobody reads these, but like the list of complaints in the Declaration of Independence about what King George was doing that made them so mad, like they're things that Trump is doing. Right? They talk about tariffs, they talk about import taxes. What was the Boston Tea Party about? And that this idea that the party that claims to be constitutional conservatives, that claims to stand for, you know, the values of the American founding, is doing literally exactly what the founding generation was upset about. I feel like that language is available to people who want to talk about what the current government is doing, and it's not used appropriately. It doesn't matter less for coverage than it is for sort of opinion journalists and the way that we write about things. But I think it's a really important and sort of underlooked at lens through which we can talk about the current crisis.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Zack made, that democracy was a very abstract issue for a lot of people. And people divorced democracy from the things that they cared about in their lives, right? So it was like democracy and the economy, like those are two separate issues, right? Where I would argue that those issues are very deeply intertwined, that the more that democracy is rigged, the economy is rigged. And on it goes. And I think for us in the media, one of our challenges is trying to make those stories less abstract and to try to make them more relatable and for people to see those linkages. But the other thing that I'm very focused on, and I think more of the media should be focused on, is the interplay between what the MAGA movement is doing in Washington and what they're doing in the States. Because I think that's going to have a huge impact on the midterms and also in 2028. One of the stories that I covered very closely was the Republican effort to overturn a state Supreme Court election in North Carolina. And that was an extremely important story, not just because the North Carolina Supreme Court isn't in and of itself important, but Republicans got a lot further than Trump did in trying to overturn that election. And it was kind of like Trump 2.0 in terms of their tactics. The Republican there did a lot of the same things Trump did. He arbitrarily challenged mail ballots and early votes that were more likely to be cast by Democrats. He specifically challenged votes only cast overseas in heavily Democratic counties, things that were so obviously cherry-picked. And the fact is, Trump didn't win any of these cases in state courts. But this effort to overturn the election in North Carolina went forward in the Court of Appeals, went forward in the state Supreme Court, and was only stopped in federal court, meaning it got a lot further than Trump had gotten. And people are going to read that as a signal now for overturning elections, and I think in some ways that's going to be more important than what Trump tried to do in terms of things that people are going to study, in terms of understanding that. At the same time, the very day that the courts ruled that the Democratic candidate had to be sworn in, another thing happened in North Carolina, which is that the State Board of Election flipped from Democratic control to Republican control, because the North Carolina had a special lame duck session 2 weeks after the election, when nobody was paying attention, they had a hurricane relief bill that was meant to address Hurricane Helene. Instead, they turned that very simple hurricane relief bill into a 95-page bill that took away the power of the state's Democratic governor to appoint a majority of members to the state election board in North Carolina. Well, why does that matter? Because the state board of election is the one who certifies elections in the state of North Carolina. The state officials also appoint the majorities of 100 county election boards in North Carolina. So now 100 counties, every single county in North Carolina is going to have a Republican majority. So when it comes time to decide, should we have things like Sunday voting, when black churches hold Souls to the Polls voter mobilization drives? Should we have early voting locations? How should we do mail voting? All of those things are now going to be decided by a Republican majority in North Carolina, as opposed to a Democratic majority. That is a story that will be covered here and there, but will get a fraction of the attention that Trump does. When you're talking about who's going to take back the House, who's going to certify the elections to retake the House, which courts are going to hear challenges if there's challenges to those elections. That's the kind of thing that Trump has almost nothing to do with that's going to have a huge impact on what happens in 2026.
Last question about journalism. Zack, you write about the rise of authoritarianism in Hungary in your book, and how Viktor Orban's attack on independent journalism helped make that happen. How's the Trump administration taking a page out of Orban's authoritarian handbook when it comes to threatening the press? And is it working as well for Trump as it did for Orban?
They are doing this, I'm going to quote a political scientist I spoke to about this. Thank God they are doing the stupidest possible version of this. They are. So they are clearly attempting to do what Orban did. And I want to be clear about what that is, right? So the Orban playbook to taking down a democracy is to go after the institutional structures that underpin democracy. They're already talked a lot about gerrymandering. That's something they did almost immediately, though in the US that's much more difficult to do at the national level, impossible, in the same way.
We have the US Senate instead.
Yeah, fair enough. But they also, I think, more relevantly for this question, went after the social pillars of democratic politics. And that means primarily the funding sources and the capabilities that allow the opposition to speak, the court system, and the media. And they went after the media in a particular way, which is going after its funding sources, forcing, through a variety of different mechanisms, independent media owners to sell to government-owned or government-aligned conglomerates. And then when Viktor Orban's friend, like one of them was literally his college roommate, took over one of them, or at least college friend. And he took over one of them and would fire the journalists that refused to toe the new government line, and by the end of it, something like 90% of Hungarian media as of 2017 was controlled by the state, or the state's allies. So that's how you do it well. The Trump administration, they don't have this kind of plan. This is the thing that's made me singularly most hopeful about the survival prospects of American democracy, is they have no clue what they're doing, right? They want to shut the media up. They would love that. They do things like kicking the AP out of the White House briefing room because they called it Gulf of Mexico, which is consistent with their long-standing policy of how you name things when the name is contested internationally. They do things like put pressure on 60 Minutes parent company in order to try to get to silence 60 Minutes criticism of Trump, which by the way is very telling about the kind of media Trump consumes, because 60 Minutes is not actually that influential anymore. Great program, but it's not like the center of American media, but Trump in his sort of age bracket is really, really interested in it. The problem is, they're not doing it well or systematically. Right? What made Orban so effective is that he found the weak point in Hungarian media, right? Finances, and specifically government distribution of ad revenue. And he pulled, and took ad revenue away from the media organizations that were going to be critical to him. He went after their broadcasting licenses. All of this stuff that was clever and subtle and hit journalists in exactly our weakest point, which is that the funding environment for journalism is terrible. Trump has no plan for doing that. His plan for doing that is to go on Twitter and yell, fake news, lying media, very biased and very mean and very unfair to Mr. Trump. And it's like, okay, or very biased and very mean, whatever. I'm going to still write my articles that are critical of you. And everyone has done that, right? There's almost no self-censorship in the media. I had a really funny, I was on a podcast and had a debate with another journalist who was more sanguine about Trump's process. And he was like, well, there's self-censorship going on. And the host of the podcast asked him, what, are people self-censoring at the New Yorker, where you work? And he's like, well, no. He's like, well, people aren't self-censoring here at the New York Times either. And it turns out that when you talk to actual journalists, very few people are changing their behavior to accommodate Trump's demands. And that is a sign that he's failing. And without silencing the press, or without forcing us to toe a line, he will not be able to effectively implement the systematic and rapid takeover that Viktor Orban did in Hungary. And that actually gives me some hope.
Last question before we open it up to audience questions. So I want to list a few of the threats to our democracy that came up in both of your books. We have gerrymandering, we have the Electoral College, voter suppression, an attack on the independent press, the takeover of the courts, the assault on public education and higher education, the whitewashing of history. What am I missing in this list? Yes, Citizens United, money in politics. So, the list feels overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's anxiety producing. And I know that you're talking about what people should focus on in terms of, what they're reading in the media. But my question is, strategically, what makes the most sense to do something about out of this long list?
Well, I think that was one of the reasons why I covered the Wisconsin Supreme Court race so closely, because it was just, it was a state Supreme Court race in one place. I mean, it was important in and of itself, but it clearly was not as important as everything that was happening in Washington. But it was symbolic, right? Because it was the kind of victory that could have ripple effects. And so I would just urge everyone here to do whatever feels achievable to you, both to try to help your own community, but then also what feels achievable but that might have broader significance, right? Because there's a million local battles now that really matter. And one of the things that I learned from covering the radicalism of democracy at the state level was when one state did something crazy and it succeeded, that started becoming something that was exported to state after state after state. And only once it had been tried in all these places was it then exported to Washington. So I think we need an alternative vision for doing things. And there's been a lot of things that California has done that have been good, that are now being tried by other places and are now becoming central to the resistance that we're seeing. So I would urge people to try to figure out what you can do locally, what you can do in your state, and what you can do that at a state or local level might also have national significance. At the same time that we think about that, we think about doing things that are shorter term, that can be achieved more immediately, whether it's stuff that can be done in 2026 or stuff that can come in 2028. I do think that at the back of our minds, we need to be thinking about long-term political reform. Because I truly believe that these structures, whether it's the anti-democratic things that are written into the Constitution, or whether it's the structure of the Supreme Court and how it's been weaponized, contributed to Donald Trump, and will contribute to future Trumps if we don't do something about them. And that this is something that's not going to be solved overnight. And something that Zack and I are both very familiar with is what's called the Power Memo, which I'm sure you guys know about. That was written by Lewis Powell, future Supreme Court Justice under Nixon in the 1960s and early 70s. And that was a time when it seemed like the left was winning, right? Where you had the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements and the environmental movement and all of these movements that had outsized impact on society. And the right realized they were losing that battle. And they were losing the war of ideas. And they needed a longer plan to take over the courts, to take over foundations, to take over universities. And they achieved that over a long period of time. It's not like Citizens United or the gutting of the Voting Rights Act or rampant gerrymandering. Those did not come out of nowhere, right? They were the result of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 60-year battles. And I think we need a similar reform agenda on the progressive side. Because on the progressive side, it often feels like we're moving from one crisis to another. and one reactionary thing to another. And the question always is, what's the larger animating vision here? And to me, that larger animating vision has to be reforming our political system to make it more democratic, to make it a democracy that doesn't exist in theory, but also exists in practice. So that's what I'd urge everyone to keep in mind while they're doing all the day-to-day fights and all the day-to-day resistance that can feel so overwhelming right now, but also keep in mind the mood of the public is changing, and things that once felt inevitable are now becoming much more contested.
You want to add to that, Zach, quickly? Or should we open up?
Yeah, watch the courts. Watch the courts, right? The area where I have the greatest concern about Trump being able to get away with something is the Supreme Court issuing a ruling that allows him to do it. And the moment that that happens, right, if it does happen, it might not. The court has been actually performed better than I expected. And the lower courts especially. Trump lost something like 96% of cases in lower courts last month, according to one tally, which is just remarkable at how unlawful, like both shows how unlawful what they're doing is, but also how badly they're doing it, that they're getting caught this easily. But if the Supreme Court gives them a blanket ability to do some of the things that they're doing right now, some of these civil liberties abuses, the arbitrary exercise of immigration enforcement to target people without due process, without habeas corpus rights, then we're entering a space where normal law doesn't work anymore, right? We're entering a space where the rules of the game aren't democratic anymore. It's a very different project, and it's very scary. And there is only one thing that you can do in those situations where the legal authorities have abdicated. And that's people have to do things, right? That's what living in a democracy means, not just going to the voting booth, but it means showing up, civil disobedience, mass political disruption. That's the moment where you need that. That's when you pull the trigger. Hopefully it'll never happen. But I think that everyone in America who cares about the future of democracy needs to prepare for the eventuality that it might, and get ready to think about what you're willing to do in that worst case scenario.
Word.
All right, we have a few minutes for audience questions. Mark back in the back, turquoise shirt, glasses. There's a microphone coming to you, yep. No, you, yes, sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I love the title, Voices Against the Tide, but in that holding, what do you think are the biggest points that you say that you're writing about that pierce through the tide, that could be heard by my racist uncle? You know, like what would resonate when you're trying to tell truth to power with people that are fundamentally hurt by that truth?
I have that uncle too.
So this is where you have to look at people's cross-cutting identities, right? By that I mean that like your racist uncle is not only racist, but also employed, possibly, maybe, I don't know. But if they're unemployed, then you can make similar kinds of arguments that I'm about to say, which is that they have interests as members of society that aren't just, I'm a racist, right? And those interests can be appealed to in certain ways. Maybe they know somebody, right? They have someone that they care about who's of a particular background, and that person, their existence, or speaking with them can break through their ideological blinders. Maybe, doesn't always work. Maybe you can talk about their employment, the fact that countries that have discriminatory social systems tend to perform much more poorly economically. That discrimination is bad for everybody. And I mean, that's not the argument I would make as to why discrimination is bad, but it is one that tends to resonate with people who don't have the same ideological commitments I do. But I think more broadly, right, at a deeper level, is don't give up on people like that. One of the most interesting findings in the political science literature on persuasion is that what matters less is the arguments you make, and what matters more is who is making them. If I were to go up to a random person on the street, I would have a much harder time persuading them than their brother or their sister or their mother or their son would, right? Speaking to people that you know directly, you know personally, and who trust you, that foundation of trust gives you extraordinary persuasive powers that no one else in society has. So micro-level action in this case, and actually engaging seriously, not just dismissing that person, but being like, I hear where you're coming from, even if you find it abhorrent, here's why I think it's wrong, and here's why that's rooted in my experience as somebody that you trust and you care about. That's how you persuade somebody Not by treating them as an enemy, but by treating them as sympathetically as you can. And if you're interested in a deeper look at this, there's research on a topic called deep canvassing, which shows how you can be persuasive in circumstances like this. It's very difficult, it takes a lot of time, and it requires a lot of empathy and sort of checking your own feelings at the door, but it does work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we obviously, we're not going to persuade everybody. There's always going to be disagreements in the country. I do think that one of the things that's broken through in the Trump era has been the power of personal stories. When Trump said he wanted to do immigration reform and he wanted to deport a lot of people, that was initially very, very popular in terms of what people thought. Then when you started to see the actual stories of this is who he's deporting and this is what he's saying, and they're not some faceless person, they're American citizens that are rooted here, that live here, that have families, that have lives. They're the ones that are being ripped away from their families. That's when Trump's numbers started to change on immigration. And that's when the collective outrage started to spread from sort of smaller pockets to broader pockets. And I've seen this a lot in my own reporting on voting rights, where there was a story of a woman in Texas. And Texas had one of those places that had a strict voter ID law, and those laws are broadly popular because 90% of the people have the ID that's required, but the question is, what about the 10% that don't have that ID for one reason or another? And there was a provision in the law that you couldn't use, if you were in a nursing home, you couldn't use the ID that you had through your nursing home to be able to vote. And so there was a woman who took her grandmother to the polls. Her grandmother didn't have the ID she needed. She doesn't have a driver's license anymore because she didn't drive. All she had was that ID from the nursing home. She was unable to vote. This was someone in a very conservative county in Texas who voted Republican, and she said, I never knew the impact of this law until it happened to me. And so we just have to keep telling the stories and keep saying, if it doesn't happen to you, it could happen to your friend, it could happen to your neighbor, it could happen to your uncle, it could happen to your grandmother. And I think the most important thing we need to do as a society right now is practice a politics of solidarity, where if it doesn't happen to us, we find someone else that someone can relate to, we tell those stories, and if it doesn't just affect us personally, we fight for them.
Next question, right here in the middle. I'm making it very difficult for you, Marisol.
So Zach, you talked about reporters and how they got defunded. The equivalent to that in the US seems to be billionaires buying up very visible media, and also a lot of media in the local level that nobody pays attention to, like TV. So my two questions are, one, how do we get a grip on how this works to start countering it, because we don't want it to get to the level of Hungary? And relatedly, is that affecting journalists? You said that people are not self-censoring, but now their editors are. How much of an effect does that actually have on what they're writing? It seems to be that there is one.
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think that on the local TV level, the rise of Sinclair Media and that enterprise has been a significant problem, right, for local information. And that long preceded Trump, right? That's not a new phenomenon. And I think it has led to a decline in the quality of local media. And it's not so much that it's just like partisan propaganda going into your local TV, though there is that. It's that there's a dearth of critical reporting on local issues, which is, I think Ari just said earlier, is like really vital to democratic civil engagement, right? And Sinclair has made that significantly harder through its acquisition of local television stations. Now, the test case for what you're talking about is really the Washington Post. Elon Musk purchasing Twitter is very bad. It also has really significantly weakened Twitter's role in our public ecosystem because nobody wants to spend a lot of time with a lot of Nazis. And so that, it matters, but it's also not a question of self-censorship. So the Bezos thing is the test, right? Because there was a clear move after the election for Bezos to try to change the way that the Post was operating. And they're just rolling out right now their new opinion section, which is focused on individual liberty and free markets, whatever the hell that means. And to me, that's the most concerning stuff, right? It's the most concerning example of something Orban-like happening in the United States. But I would, first, we'll see what the opinion rollout looks like in the Post. Second, the Post's news site, right, which is separate from opinion, has done really excellent work and deep and difficult coverage on a variety of different issues affecting the Trump administration. It's very clear that whatever Bezos' personal agenda and whatever his changes to the staffing at the Post, that hasn't manifested in like really the kind of pervasive self-censorship that we saw, or forced censorship that we saw at Hungarian outlets. So it's just, there are worrying signs here, but there's also so much more independent media besides the Washington Post. It's just not happening here in the same way, right? Trump has not been able to marshal his allies to do the same thing. Elon Musk threatened to buy MSNBC at one point, and that seems like a joke now. And it should seem like a joke. So we have a little bit of resiliency. That makes me a little more hopeful.
I'm more concerned about the media than Zack is, just because if you think about all the different things that are happening, the effort to defund PBS and NPR, the fact that Sesame Street is on Netflix for the first time ever, so it's going to be less accessible to millions of more Americans. The fact that billionaire owners are controlling more and more, that there's less and less media than there ever was before. I think all of this is creating a crisis of democracy, and I think we have to understand that the crisis of the media is a crisis for democracy, and someone is going to have to step in at some point to fill this void, because every single year there's more and more and more unemployed journalists. And I mean, that matters to me personally, but that means there's many, many, many people that can get away with doing unethical, corrupt, illegal things without something calling them out on it. So I think it's a broader term trend that's gotten worse under Trump that I think should concern all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that as a basic matter. I just was making the narrower point that we're not seeing a takeover, a sort of Hungary equivalent authoritarian takeover of independent media.
Zack and Ari are going to be signing books outside. I've been told that we have to wrap this up on time, and it is time. So you all, if you want to speak to Zack and Ari, line up outside to the right, and they'll be signing books.